Did you know that many of the very first vegan feminists were what we might call today witches? Stick around. Let me explain. So welcome to the channel, folks. My name is Dr. Corey Wren. I am a vegan sociologist, a vegan feminist, and a vegan witch. So this channel was started out of a desire for myself to bring some kind of material form to this idea that what we're doing as women, as feminists in the animal rights movement is oftentimes very much so what we would consider to be very witchy and magical. We're setting intentions, we're confronting power, we're standing up for the more vulnerable, we are seeing power in relationships with fellow animals and with nature. It seems very witchy to me. So after I published that book, I was also working on another book called Vegan Feminism. And this is a much longer project that I've been tinkering with off and on really since the early 2010s. But after I really started to hone in on the research for that book, my idea was I wanted to look at how vegan feminism is not just some new millennial thing. In fact, people have been doing this intersectional work for a much longer. So I looked into the 19th century, into what I would consider the first wave of vegan feminism. And that's not always an accurate term, by the way, because veganism obviously wasn't as popular or well known in the 19th century. But I say that with a little bit of caution because vegan activism was present in the 19th century. There were many vegan communes, there were many vegan activists. The very first president of the British SPCA, Louis Gompertz, for instance, he was a vegan. And we're talking back in the 1820s and 30s. By the way, the Vegan Society was also formed in 1944, but that was only after many decades of fighting with the Vegetarian Society because they didn't want to accept vegans. They thought it was too radical. So vegans have been around for a while. So sometimes I'll say vegan feminist, but really it's a vegetarian feminist. And perhaps today they would be a vegan, knowing what we know now and having the background that we have now. So I was really interested, I found it really fascinating when I looked back into the 19th century and all the record. And by the way, I think there's a bit of a misnomer when we think about the 19th century. Nobody cared about animals. Nobody was fighting for animals. That's absolutely not true. It was actually a very heightened point of advocacy for non-human animals. The problem is who writes the record. So the victors tend to write the history books, and then everyone else sort of gets lost along the way. But actually, if you know where to look, the people who were doing vegetarian activism, vegan activism, animal rights activism, they were quite prolific writers and campaigners. And a lot of that is still accessible today if you just go and look for it. So I'm not going to give you the whole history of vegan feminism in the 19th century. But what I thought was really interesting here, why am I even doing this work? I think it's important to reclaim that lost history. Because if we think that vegan feminism is just sort of this fringe element of society, this marginalized thing that only a few hipsters in the 21st century are into, that really disempowers us in a lot of ways. It's dislocating us from this long legacy of really hard work that people have been doing, and a lot of them being women, for over 100 years, 200 years plus. So I think it's very important for us to reclaim our history. We see the same thing in witchcraft, for instance. So we know that witchcraft, or at least how it was popularly practiced, basically folk healers and midwives, they were actively stamped out over the centuries. And then eventually in the 19th century, it was outlawed for women to practice any of that kind of stuff. So one of the important things then with the modern witchcraft movement was to reclaim that history and reclaim that power, and basically taking up where we left off before all of this interference. This is not to say that there's this long lineage of witches across time, like that's not historically accurate, but there have been people, at least here in the British Isles, who've been practicing herbalism and midwifery and all that kind of stuff for a very long time. And now we're just now starting to come back to that knowledge base that we've been disconnected from. And in being open about that and embracing that that is a very important form of power, especially for women. So this is why you see in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s and beyond, women really latching on to witchcraft, because for the first time, all the power that we've had that has been suppressed for so long is now being reopened to us. And we realize that actually it was there with us all along. Knowing how to work with animals, with magic, with the natural cycles, etc., like coming back into that, stepping back into that. It's a source of power and encouragement, isn't it? So it's the same thing with other social movements. When you're looking at the vegan feminist movement, I thought it was very essential that we go back to the 19th century and reclaim a lot of these important conversations, discourses, and campaigns that were begun well before we were even born. Now, here's where the interesting overlap really begins. Is that what else was happening in the 19th century? Okay, so there was an active modernization project. There was industrialization, rationalization. So no witchcraft, no psychics, no herbalism, no midwives, no any of that kind of stuff. Now it's about science, research, and medicine, and all this kind of Western stuff. Rational approaches to life. Now that is a very abrupt change for, I'm talking about in the United States, in the United Kingdom, Ireland, the Western space, basically. That was a pretty abrupt change. Sociologically, we know that people have been living communally in an agricultural way of life for thousands and thousands of years. And then all of a sudden in the late 1700s and into the 1800s, we have a dramatic revolution of our way of life. And because that was so abrupt, it caused quite a lot of feeling of detachment, feeling of alienation. There was a spike in a lot of social problems because population changes were happening very quickly. City infrastructures couldn't keep up. Inequality dramatically increased, et cetera, which is, by the way, here's where the birth of sociology is, because now we have people coming in to try to understand these major changes and try to address them. Some people really had difficulty with that. And so there was a lot of religious reformations at that time, religious movements, especially in the United States. We see a lot of major religious revivals. And then, here's where it gets interesting, we also have a lot of spiritualism that really explodes in the 19th century in the US and the UK and elsewhere. Now, there is overlap. We see that this spiritualism is one of those ways that women actually can find some political power and cultural sway in a society that is becoming increasingly hostile to women and women in power. And basically, women couldn't vote, women couldn't own property, women really were disenfranchised in many ways. But spiritualism was one way that women kind of tapped into this idea that we're more intuitive and connected to the unseen, to animals, to nature, to the cosmos. And so this is one of the reasons women are actually able to make careers in spiritualism. The spiritualist thing took off in the 19th century, so much so that entire spiritualist societies formed here in the UK. The London Spiritualist Society was like tons and tons of people who were members of this. Lots of people did seances. Lots of people went and visited people who they thought could speak to their dead relatives. It was just a normal, I think we lose sight of that. It was a very normal part of Western life to have this spiritualism. And interestingly, quite a lot of people got into dabbling with it themselves. They didn't necessarily feel like they had to go to an expert to communicate with the dead. They were doing it themselves. So this is interesting. We actually see quite a lot of the vegan feminists from the 19th century, the early 20th century, heavily involved in spiritualism, heavily involved. The overlap also goes into, by the way, animal rights, welfare work, vegetarianism. This was another space for women to really get involved and show their political voice in a time when they could not vote. They were barred from politics, getting involved with charities, starting charities, running charities, volunteering, intervening on animals, writing about animals. This was a very important political voice for women. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why by the turn of the 20th century, the feminist movement and the animal rights movement had sort of melded into one, and animal rights became really associated with feminism, or at least with women, something that the animal rights movement, very sadly, since the 1960s and 70s has been trying to deconstruct, which is deeply misogynistic, but that's another video. So anyway, a lot of these women were stepping into their power as animal rights activists, as speakers, as campaigners, as writers, and then also stepping into their power as spiritualists. So there are two, well, I'll talk to you about three, but there's two major ones that come to mind when I'm thinking about vegan feminist witches. And the first one has to be Anna Kingsford. Anna Kingsford did not live very long. By all accounts, she was a very frail woman, but she was a deeply wise and very productive woman. She was born of a wealthy background. She was a campaigner for women's rights. And she also was very ardently an anti-vivisectionist. So she was one of the very first voices speaking out against the practice of vivisection, which was exploding at the time in the mid-1800s. And also, she was a vegetarian activist. So very interestingly, she jumped into medical school, and she had to go to medical school in Paris, by the way, because England, it was not allowed in the mid-1800s for women to get medical degrees. So she had to go to France to do that. But she got a medical degree basically so she could understand what was happening with animals in medical institutions and be qualified to speak out against that. Because one of the ways that vivisection was allowed to prosper and to explode as it did was by disparaging people who criticized it, by saying, well, you don't know what you're talking about because you don't have a science degree. And then conveniently, women aren't allowed to, or a lot of the women who were doing criticism were conveniently not allowed to get medical degrees, so they could never have a proper criticism so making their own rules up, right? So she said, all right, whatever, goes over to France and gets a medical degree. And one of the first things that she does is she writes a book on the science of vegetarianism. And so she was very much so one of those all-around animal rights people, where she was looking at lots of different ways that animals are harmed in different systems, and transporting animals to be killed for food, the slaughtering process. She was also, by the way, interested in how the slaughtering process impacted humans as well. And so she was very intersectional in that way. So she was really, really, she was a sensitive soul, like I am, and like many of us are, when we have to deal with the extremities of animal violence all day long throughout, especially if you, like myself, and you do it for a living. You're writing about it and researching about it all the time. So she was really, really beaten down by it. And I think one of the ways that she was able to cope with that is that she would hold seances in her home, and she would actually try to speak with the victims of vivisection, and their voices could be heard. She also did dream work. She has an entire book where she recorded her dreams, and she had conversations with animals. And so in this way, they actually were given voice in the English language, and they could have, she could then vouch on their behalf in that way. And so she was very much so involved in that. In fact, there was a really nasty vivisector, and she spent a lot of work criticizing him in a spiritual way. She was also working against him. So I don't know exactly what she did when she was in her home doing her witchy ways, but the vivisector ended up dying, and she took that on herself and felt responsible for having done that, for better or for worse. I don't think she was very happy about it. I think she felt a bit of remorse. But she maybe not have would have identified herself as a witch, because she actually used that language to discuss her enemies. So these vivisectors who were doing all this horrible stuff to non-human animals just for the sake of interest, curiosity, profit seeking, class ascension, no anesthesia being used. And I won't get into the nitty gritty. You can, if you're interested, her colleague, Frances Power Cobb is a leading woman who did a lot of vivisection exposés. And if you look her up, you'll see a lot of the writings and illustrations associated with what these vivisectors were doing. And you can see for yourself why this was so upsetting and really just bad science. So anyway, that's Anna Kingsford. And yeah, she ended up dying very young. She was, I think, about 40 years old when she died. And since then, her legacy actually has continued. And this is an interesting thing. So I want to then jump to the second person. And the second person is Lizzy Lind-af-Hageby. Lizzy was born around the time when Anna Kingsford died. And Lizzy was actually coming from Sweden. And Lizzy, by the way, was probably more of a powerhouse than Anna Kingsford was, and more than even Frances Power Cobb, two of the biggest forces in animal rights in the 19th century. She, like Anna, also felt the need to go and get a medical degree so that she could see for herself what was going on, document what was going on, and then speak credibly about resisting that and critiquing it. And she went on to do so many more other things. I will leave a link to a longer video that covers all the amazing things that Lizzy did. Don't really have time to do all that in this particular video, but I wanted to highlight here that she also felt herself connected to the psychic realm. But more importantly, she even thought she was connected psychically to Anna Kingsford, who had died. And so she, maybe not calls herself a witch, but in very many ways, she's embodying what we think about with witchcraft today in modern times. And it really wasn't revealed until, if you look online, you can find her obituary, I think, from a UK psychic society. And in that obituary, first off, it makes clear that this psychic work was a major part of her life. Despite all she was such a busy woman, all the campaigning she did. It's likely she was a vegan. She's a very prolific author, an important suffragette, feminist leader. She documented what was going on in vivisection hospitals and laboratories and wrote about that. And she got sent to libel court twice over her work for that. She actually spent ages and ages advocating just in the UK to switch to stun guns instead of poleaxing animals in the face. She is such a powerhouse. And yet, throughout all that hard work she was doing, she relied on this supernatural, spiritual work to sustain her and to kind of ground her in this longer legacy of women who had been doing that work, which I think is really sweet and quite fascinating as well. But it reveals in that obituary that not only was she doing a lot of this psychic work, but also she felt herself connected to Anna Kingsford in a sort of metaphysical way. Neat, right? There's also Charlotte Despard, who was an Irish, Anglo-Scottish, Irish nationalist suffragette, hardcore vegetarian, was a president, I think she was president of the Vegetarian Society in London. She was an anti-vivisectionist. She was also very much so involved in all kinds of women's rights struggles and animal rights struggles, too many to list here. And she was also involved in this spiritual work as well. So it seems like this is a society in transition, a culture in transition from a more agricultural, rural community type of living where people kind of took power into their own hands in order to make things happen, in now to a more rationalized society where it's all about experiments and evidence and patriarchal norms. And I think there was a lot of frustration over that rapidness of change, the rapidness of social inequality, the frustration that women are feeling and not having access to official, legitimate power spaces. And yet they have all this power and the knowledge of how to do this important campaigning and resistance and finding medical degrees when they're barred from that type of knowledge. And maybe then spiritualism is kind of part of that. Maybe I think there's something there where if you feel this sort of frustration with the slowness of social change, and you feel this frustration with this limited power you have, like with all the power that we do have as feminists, vegan feminist activists, we still have that sense of powerlessness because we, at the end of the day, are not the ones pushing the buttons, controlling the levers. We're knocking on that door, banging on that door, trying to get in. And so after a certain point, I think a lot of us just become really frustrated and downtrodden. And that's one of the reasons why I have been advocating vegan witchcraft as a means of grounding ourselves and setting intentions and trying to manifest, but also, sitting with that helplessness sometimes and trying to refocus our attention onto what we can affect, what we can change, and also paying more attention to that which has been taken from us, lost from us, that being these radical, compassionate relationships with other animals and with nature itself. And I'm willing to bet that that's a lot of what was found fueling what Anna Kingsford, Charlotte Despard, and Lizzy Lind-af-Hageby were doing when they engaged with spiritualism. And by the way, there's more and more. I didn't even mention Annie Besant, another feminist and anti-colonial activist from the era. There's many, many, many more. So I leave that for you to contemplate and perhaps do some extra research on your own to explore. But yeah, it's a really fascinating intersection where we have women who are doing this amazing feminist work, anti-colonial work, anti-racist work, abolitionist work, vegetarian work, anti-vivisectionist work, and then also integrating it with this spirituality, which is not just spirituality as far as, like in a religious sense, but it's in a sense of resistance, a way to fortify themselves and help them along in their goals, not just to offer solace or to contemplate the cosmos, but more than that. This is about, fortifying themselves as activists. So let me know what you think in this really fascinating history. I could probably write a whole book on it. I don't think I will. But if you find out more interesting, if you have any more interesting information about women who are doing this work, this metaphysical work in the 19th century, and also who were feminists and vegans or vegetarians, do put it in the comments below. I'd love to learn more about that. So keep it witchy, folks, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.